When Kirkstall Abbey was established in the 1150s, its charter claimed that these monks had left the city to come out into the wilderness to be closer to God. Now, anyone who knows Kirkstall knows that it was not particularly a wilderness. It was a very good piece of property, very near a river, good water flow, well protected by the hills, and also very good agricultural land. I suspect for Selby Abbey, a very similar charter exists with a very similar claim. And again, we know that Selby Abbey was not exactly the wilderness, but again, very good farmland surrounded by good water supplies and a very good place to be. So why did these charters claim this? Well, the reason is because there had been a long history in Christian tradition of those who wanted to get closer to God, of leaving the cities and going out into the wilderness. The most famous example of this was Anthony. Anthony was a very wealthy young man, inherited a load of money from his parents, and decided that he was going to follow God. So he, sadly, I guess on her behalf, paid for his sister to become a nun, gave the rest of his money away, and went from Alexandria, one of the most cosmopolitan and cities in the Roman Empire, one of the great centers of learning, out into the Egyptian desert, where he lived as a hermit. And many people followed him, leaving the city to go out into the country, into the wilderness, to meet God. And this has been a large part of Christian tradition, that people have gone into nature to find God, into the wilderness. There is a discrimination, a prejudice against the city in many spiritual traditions. Why is that? Well, I think often the city is seen as a place of overemphasis on money, overemphasis on materialism, overemphasis on relationships between people, overemphasis on getting ahead. And all these things are seen by many spiritual writers as being the thing that will hold you back in your spiritual life. Also, the cities are seen as places of comfort. If you want something in cities, you can go buy them. If you want food, you want drink, you want a house, you can just go buy one. Whereas in your wilderness, you have to provide for yourself. There's no one to bake your bread for you. You must bake your own bread. There's no one to build your house for you. You must build your own house or find a cave or something like that to live in. And so the place, in many traditions, the place of the wilderness is the place to encounter God. And in the two readings we had today, we've had first the reading where Moses meets God in the wilderness. He's out taking care of the sheep out in the middle of nowhere and runs into the burning bush. That's where he finds God, who then changes his life. Or in the readings we had from the various Gospels, we see that Jesus regularly got away from his disciples, got away from the crowds, and went into lonely places, onto mountains or whatever, to pray, to be alone with God. And of course, as we come up on Lent, we will be remembered next week about Jesus going into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights at the beginning of his ministry to set himself right with himself and with God. And many Christians and many other people of other religious traditions have followed him in a very similar way, to go out of the city, out from civilization, out into the wilderness, to find God and to find themselves. And why is that? Well, I think the first thing, as I said, there is a lot of distraction in cities and civilization. It's a place where people have obligations to one another, and obligations to their families, obligations to their business partners, obligation to society. By going out into the wilderness, they can put those behind them and not be distracted by those obligations. Secondly, in many places, the wilderness is a place of great beauty. And there's always been a tradition that God is somehow contained within the beauty of creation. For Christians, he's contained within the beauty of creation because creation is his. He made it, and it reveals him. So not only have Christians found God through natural sciences and through studying the way of nature, they've also found God through just being in the beauty of nature. Probably the most important thing is it takes away whatever distractions, whether they be social distractions, our own distractions, and allows us to concentrate on God, to clear our minds. I think in almost every spiritual tradition, the greatest problem for prayer and being with God is all the distractions we have. The Buddhists called it the monkey mind. But as you begin to pray, all these things come to your mind, whether your need to, what your shopping list is, what jobs you need to do, angers, fears, whatever, bubble up. And in most spiritual traditions, there are techniques, ways of calming the mind so that you may open yourself to God and get rid of all those extraneous thoughts. And being in the wilderness, of course, allows us to do that by pulling away so many distractions. It's very interesting that at the end of World War I, and they wanted to mark those who had died, the question was asked, what should we do? And someone came up with a radical idea. Let's have 2 minutes of silence. Now, why was this a radical idea? The reason it was a radical idea is until that time, that silence was pretty pervasive in the world. If you were out in the countryside, there was very little noise. There was of course no engines, no cars or tractors or lorries. There was just the sound of people. There was no radio, there was no television, and so the world was a quite quiet place. Cities might have been noisier, but still a lot of the noise that we associate with cities wasn't there. But by 1920, it became clear the world was very noisy. And so what was radical was not the noise, but to stop the noise and have silence. And that's really marked our modern world since. For all of us, there is a lot of noise around us. We carry in our pockets our phones that can tune us into YouTube or Spotify or BBC Radio or whatever, and they're constantly going off. We go into restaurants, we go into shops, we go into any place, and there's quite often music being played in. There's the constant sound of traffic. There's the constant sound of aircraft. The world we live in is very noisy. And that noise distracts us. It pulls us away from ourselves and pulls us away from concentration. And so in order for us to find God and to find prayer and to find time to reflect, we need to find quiet. We need to find the wilderness. Now, for many of us, that is just not possible for us to go and live out in the middle of nowhere as hermits. That's just not reality. Many of us cannot dedicate our lives to going living in quiet places. So it's much harder for us. We actually have to create that silence, that quiet place in our day. And I think this time that we've spent in the last year in lockdown has given us an opportunity to do that. The noise certainly has dropped because there's far less aircraft, far less traffic, but we've quite often filled that with our own noise. Binge watching box sets, which we're all guilty of, turning on the radio and just having noise around us. And that's perhaps why for many of us the wilderness experience we've had so far has been so negative and so much frightening, like we talked about last week. But we also can turn it into a positive thing if we take that time to cut away some of the things that are holding us back from having some quiet, getting to know who we are and who God is. Creating in our days just some moments of quiet where we turn off the radio, turn off our phones, turn off the computer, and just allow ourselves to be in quiet and prayer and allow our minds to calm. We aren't so distracted by all the people knocking on the doors or making demands on us because of the changes. This is an opportunity perhaps for us to take that time and actually deepen our lives. On Wednesday we start Lent, a time when Christians traditionally have spent time not only fasting, but also deepening their prayer life, deepening their knowledge of God by study, by making time for more prayer. And I invite you, over the next few weeks before lockdown begins to be lifted and we return to our normal lives, try and find some of that quiet in your life. Use the wilderness as a place to get away from distractions. Use the wilderness of this time to find peace, to find God, to find yourself.